3 days after the raids, Daniel Brennan returned to the park. Thomas met him in the visitor center parking lot, hardly recognizing the man who climbed carefully out of his father's car. Daniel was clean, dressed in fresh clothes, and though he still moved gingerly on crutches, he looked 1,000 times better than the frightened, injured person they'd found in the forest. Daniel's parents were with him, a couple in their 60s who looked like they hadn't stopped smiling since their son was found alive. His mother hugged Thomas so tightly he could barely breathe, thanking him over and over. His father shook Thomas's hand with tears in his eyes, unable to find adequate words. "I wanted to see it again," Daniel said, looking out at the forest. "I know that sounds strange after everything that happened, but I needed to come back. To see it without fear, you know?" Thomas understood completely. "How about I give you the official tour? Show you some places that are actually on the trails this time?" They spent the afternoon walking the easier paths near the visitor center, Daniel managing surprisingly well with his crutches. His parents walked a little ahead, giving Daniel and Thomas space to talk. Daniel wanted to hear the whole story, how the camera had been found, what the investigation had uncovered, how many people had been arrested. "Agent Foster told me they found the guy who was chasing me," Daniel said quietly as they stopped near a scenic overlook. "The one whose boots I saw in that last video. His name was Tony something. He's facing all kinds of charges," Thomas nodded. "They all are. Conspiracy, drug trafficking, weapons charges, and because your life was threatened, there are additional penalties. Agent Foster thinks the main organizers are looking at 20 years minimum." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. "I keep thinking about those weeks in the forest. How scared I was, how many times I thought about just trying to make a run for it. Injuries and all. But something kept telling me to wait, to stay hidden, to trust that someone would find my camera." "You made the right choice," Thomas assured him. "If you'd tried to hike out with that broken ankle, especially with those guys actively looking for you, things could have ended very differently. The survival training my dad made me take when I was a teenager probably saved my life," Daniel said with a slight laugh. "I complained so much about those wilderness courses. Turns out they were worth every minute." Daniel's father, overhearing this, called back, "Told you so." Both parents were smiling, just happy to have their son back and able to joke about anything at all. As they continued walking, Daniel asked about the Beaver Dam where his camera had been found. "Can we go see it?" "Is it far?" Thomas checked his watch. "It's about an hour's hike on the trail, but we can drive pretty close if you're up for it." He looked at Daniel's crutches doubtfully. "I'm up for it," Daniel said firmly. "I need to see where it all ended up." They drove to a closer access point and made the shorter walk to Willow Creek. The Beaver Dam stood as sturdy as ever, the water flowing around and through it in the timeless way it had for years. Daniel stood looking at it for a long time, leaning on his crutches. "Right there," Thomas pointed. "Your camera was wedged in about there, about 2 feet down from the top. The beavers had built around it like it was just another branch." Daniel shook his head in amazement. "Those beavers are the unsung heroes of this story. They caught my camera and kept it safe until you found it." He turned to Thomas. "How long do you think it would have been before someone discovered what was going on if you hadn't found the camera?" Thomas had thought about that question a lot over the past few days. "Honestly? Could have been months, maybe years. We had no reason to patrol that area regularly. If someone had eventually stumbled onto the operation, who knows what would have happened to them? You might have saved other lives by recording that footage." Over the next few weeks, the story exploded into the national news. A hiker's waterproof camera, lost in a creek and lodged in a beaver dam, had brought down a major drug trafficking operation. The media loved every angle of it. Daniel was interviewed on several news programs, though he insisted he wasn't a hero, just someone who'd been in the wrong place at the right time with a camera. The story brought attention to the park too, though not all of it welcome. Tourists started showing up wanting to see the famous Beaver Dam, turning it into an unlikely attraction. Thomas had to post additional signs asking people to respect the wildlife and not disturb the dam. The beavers, unbothered by their newfound fame, continued their work as if nothing had changed. The legal proceedings moved forward quickly. With the video evidence, Daniel's testimony, and the massive amount of drugs and documentation seized during the raids, most of the defendants agreed to plea deals. Carl Hendricks, the former park maintenance supervisor who'd organized the whole operation, refused to cooperate and went to trial. The jury took less than 4 hours to find him guilty on all counts. Agent Foster called Thomas the day the verdict came in. "Hendricks got 25 years," she said. "No chance of parole for at least 15. The others got sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years depending on their level of involvement." "What about Rick?" Thomas asked, referring to the seasonal ranger who'd been the inside man. 12 years. He tried to claim he was coerced, but the evidence showed he was being paid quite well for his information. He deposited over $100,000 in various accounts over the 18 months he worked for them. Thomas felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it was still painful to think about the betrayal. The Park Service had implemented new screening procedures for employees and increased security measures throughout the park. It would never be quite as open and trusting as it had been, but maybe that was necessary. 6 months after the raid, Daniel returned to the park again. This time he came alone, with a brand new camera and a hiking permit for a week-long trip. Thomas met him at the ranger station to check him in. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked, looking at Daniel's permit. "It's only been 6 months. Nobody would blame you if you never wanted to set foot in these woods again." Daniel smiled. "That's exactly why I need to do this. I can't let fear win. This place is beautiful. And what happened here was because of criminals, not because of the forest itself. I need to make new memories here, good ones." Thomas understood. He processed Daniel's permit and went over the trail map with him, making sure Daniel knew where all the ranger stations and emergency call points were located. "And this time," Thomas said with a grin, "try to stay on the marked trails." "Deal," Daniel laughed. Before Daniel headed out, he handed Thomas a wrapped package. "This is for you. Just a small thank you." Thomas opened it to find a beautiful framed photograph. It showed Willow Creek at sunset, with the Beaver Dam prominently featured in the foreground. The light was perfect, catching the water droplets and making the whole scene glow. In the bottom corner, Daniel had written, "To Thomas, who found the message in a bottle, or in this case, in a beaver dam. With gratitude, Daniel." "This is incredible," Thomas said, genuinely moved. "Thank you. That was taken last month," Daniel explained. "I came back on a day trip to scout locations. I'm actually thinking about doing a whole photography series on the park, showing its beauty and resilience. Maybe even write a book about the whole experience if I can work up the courage." "I think you should," Thomas encouraged. "People need to hear stories like yours. Stories about survival, about courage, about how even in the darkest situations, hope can survive." After Daniel left on his hike, Thomas hung the photograph in the ranger station where he'd see it every day. It became a reminder of why he did this job, not just to maintain trails and enforce regulations, but to protect a place where people could connect with nature, challenge themselves, and sometimes, without even knowing it, become part of something much larger than themselves. The Beaver Dam continued to stand on Willow Creek, the beavers adding to it and maintaining it with the same dedication they'd always shown. Hikers would stop to take pictures of it, most not knowing the crucial role it had played in a real-life drama. The forest grew and changed with the seasons. Wildlife went about their business, and the old mining tunnels, now permanently sealed by the government, began the slow process of being reclaimed by nature. A year after the raid, Thomas received a letter from Daniel. He was doing well, working again as an environmental scientist, and had recently gotten engaged. The book he'd mentioned was in progress, with a publisher already interested. But what touched Thomas most was the last paragraph of the letter. "I think about that time in the woods often," Daniel wrote, "not with fear anymore, but with a strange kind of gratitude. It taught me how strong I could be, how much I could endure. It showed me that even when everything seems hopeless, there can be hope in the smallest things. A waterproof camera case, a beaver dam, a park ranger doing his job. All these small things came together to save my life and stop something terrible. It reminds me that we're all connected, that our actions matter in ways we might never fully understand. The camera captured the evidence, but you captured the meaning of it. Thank you for that." Thomas folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer, next to a small token Agent Foster had given him, a replica FBI badge with an inscription thanking him for his service to the investigation. He didn't consider himself a hero. He'd just been doing his job, checking on a beaver dam like he'd done 1,000 times before. But that one time, that one ordinary morning, had changed everything. He walked outside and looked at the forest stretching out in every direction, thinking about all the stories it held, All the dramas and triumphs and quiet moments that happened here every day. Most would never be known beyond the people who experienced them. But every once in a while, through a combination of chance, courage, and care, a story would emerge that reminded everyone why places like this mattered. The park was safe again. Families came to hike and camp. Couples got engaged at scenic overlooks. Children learned about wildlife and conservation. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a beaver dam stood in a creek. Just one small piece of nature doing what nature does, building, maintaining, persisting. Thomas smiled and headed back inside. He had trails to check, visitors to help, and a forest to protect. It was just another day at work. But he'd learned that sometimes that was when the most important things happened. When you were just doing your job, paying attention, caring about the details. That's when you might find something extraordinary stuck in an ordinary beaver dam. And if you were lucky, if you paid attention and did the right thing, that discovery might just change everything. The helicopter lifted off with Daniel inside, bound for the nearest hospital 2 hours away. Thomas watched it disappear over the tree line, feeling both relieved and anxious. They'd found Daniel alive, which was the outcome everyone had hoped for but few had actually expected. But now came the hard part, using what Daniel knew to take down the people responsible for putting him through weeks of terror in the wilderness. Back at the ranger station, the atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a missing person case had evolved into a full-scale criminal investigation. More agents had arrived overnight, along with tactical units and additional surveillance specialists. The small station that usually housed just Thomas and 2 other rangers was now home to what looked like a small army. Agent Foster had set up a temporary command center in the conference room, with multiple screens showing feeds from the cameras they'd placed around the mining tunnel. Thomas stood in the doorway watching the organized chaos. Foster noticed him and waved him over. "Daniel's stable," she said without preamble. "The doctors say he's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and his ankle is broken in 2 places. But he'll make a full recovery." She pulled up a chair for Thomas. "And he's talking. Even doped up on painkillers, he insisted on telling us everything he remembered." She opened a tablet and pulled up a voice recording. "I had one of our agents record his statement at the hospital. I think you should hear this." Daniel's voice came through, weak but determined. He described how he'd been on the 3rd day of a planned week-long solo backpacking trip when his GPS had started acting weird, probably from the mineral deposits in that area messing with the signal. He'd gotten turned around and ended up near the old mining area, which wasn't even supposed to be accessible from the trails he'd been on. He'd heard voices and hidden instinctively, his wilderness training telling him to assess any unknown situation before revealing himself. That's when he'd seen the men with the crates, heard enough of their conversation to realize this was something illegal and dangerous. He'd started recording, thinking he could turn the footage over to authorities when he got back to civilization. But one of the men had spotted movement in the bushes where Daniel was hiding. They'd shouted and Daniel had run. He described crashing through the forest in blind panic, hearing men behind him, hearing them call out to each other as they tried to track him down. When he'd hit the creek, he'd thought about crossing it to throw them off his trail, but he'd slipped on the wet rocks and fallen in. That's when he'd lost his camera. Daniel had managed to pull himself out of the water downstream, his ankle already swelling from the fall. He'd heard the men searching the area, so he'd hidden in the thick underbrush and waited. For hours, he'd stayed completely still, listening to them search for him. Eventually, they'd given up, assuming he'd either drowned or been swept far enough downstream that he was no longer a threat. But Daniel knew he couldn't go back the way he'd come. The men would be watching for him, and with his injured ankle, he couldn't move fast enough to reach the park boundaries before they found him. So he'd made the decision to hide, to survive in the wilderness until he could figure out a safe way to get help. "I kept thinking I should try to hike out," Daniel's recorded voice said, "but I was terrified they'd spot me on the trails. I saw them a few times driving around on ATVs, clearly looking for something. Looking for me, I guess, so I stayed hidden. I found that old ranger cabin and scavenged what I could. I knew I couldn't light fires because the smoke might give away my position. I ate berries, caught some fish with my hands in the shallow parts of the creek. I drank water and prayed that someone would find my camera and understand what they were seeing." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. Daniel had been living in fear for 4 weeks, injured and alone, just miles from help but unable to reach it safely. The camera had been his only hope of rescue, and it had worked. The recording continued with Daniel describing the layout of the operation as he'd seen it. The men used the mining tunnel as a storage and distribution point. Trucks would arrive at the old service road in the middle of the night, unload their cargo and leave. The drugs would be stored in the tunnel, then broken down into smaller shipments and moved out through different routes. It was a sophisticated operation that had probably been running for years. Agent Foster stopped the recording. Daniel's testimony, combined with the video evidence and what we're seeing from our surveillance, gives us enough to move forward. But we want to do this right. We need to identify everyone involved and understand the full scope of the network before we make arrests. Over the next several days, Thomas found himself playing an unexpected role in the investigation. His knowledge of the park, its history, and its hidden corners became invaluable. He helped the FBI identify other possible routes the smugglers might be using, old logging roads and forgotten trails that didn't appear on modern maps. He also discovered something disturbing during this process. One of the seasonal rangers, a guy named Rick who'd been hired about 18 months ago, had access to keys and codes for all the park facilities. Rick had called in sick the day after Daniel was found, and when agents went to his apartment in town, they found it completely cleared out. He'd run. "We think he was their inside man," Agent Park explained to Thomas, "someone who could keep them informed about ranger patrols, visitor traffic patterns, and any unusual activity in the park." It explains how they operated so boldly for so long. Thomas felt betrayed. He'd trusted Rick, had trained him, had recommended him for a permanent position. The idea that someone he'd worked alongside was actually helping criminals operate in the park made him sick. But there was no time to dwell on it. The investigation was reaching its critical phase. Surveillance had identified a pattern. Every 5 days, a major shipment would arrive at the mining tunnel around 2 in the morning. The next shipment was due to arrive tomorrow night, and Foster had made the decision to move then. "We'll have teams positioned at every possible exit point from the tunnel system," she explained during the final briefing. "When they move the drugs in, we move in on them. Simultaneous raids at the tunnel site and at 3 other locations we've identified as distribution centers in neighboring states." Thomas was given a specific role. He would be with a team positioned near the main park entrance, ready to close it off if anyone tried to flee that direction. It wasn't a combat role, he wasn't trained or equipped for that, but it was important. Every exit needed to be covered. The night of the operation was cold and moonless. Perfect conditions for the smugglers, but also perfect for law enforcement moving into position. Thomas sat in an unmarked vehicle with 2 FBI agents, watching the dark entrance road through night vision equipment. His radio was tuned to the operation's main frequency, and he could hear the quiet check-ins from various teams as they moved into position. At 1:45 in the morning, surveillance reported 2 trucks approaching the mining tunnel from the old service road, right on schedule. Foster's calm voice came through the radio. "All teams stand by. Let them commit. We want everyone inside before we move." Thomas felt his heart pounding. This was really happening. Months, maybe years of criminal activity was about to come crashing down. He thought about Daniel, probably sleeping in a hospital bed, safe but still recovering from his ordeal. This was for him, and for every person who came to this park expecting it to be a safe place. At 2:15, Foster gave the order. "All teams, go, go, go." What happened next was controlled chaos. Thomas couldn't see the action at the mining tunnel, but he could hear it over the radio. Tactical teams moving in, shouting commands, suspects attempting to flee. There were sounds of vehicles starting, people running, and then about 10 minutes into the operation, headlights appeared on the road leading to Thomas's position. "We've got a runner," one of the agents in Thomas's vehicle said calmly. He relayed their position over the radio while the driver pulled their vehicle across the road, blocking it. 2 more FBI vehicles appeared from side roads, creating a complete roadblock. The approaching vehicle, a beat-up pickup truck, skidded to a stop about 50 feet away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door flew open and someone jumped out, starting to run into the forest on foot. But agents were already moving, pursuing with flashlights and professional efficiency. Within minutes, they had the suspect in custody. Thomas recognized him as one of the men from Daniel's video. Even dirty and disheveled, there was no mistaking the face. The man was shouting, claiming he hadn't done anything wrong, that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the agents weren't interested in his excuses. They read him his rights and loaded him into one of their vehicles. Over the next hour, similar scenes played out at roadblocks and checkpoints throughout the area. The operation at the mining tunnel had caught most of the smuggling crew by surprise. Some had tried to flee through the tunnel system, only to find FBI agents waiting at the exit points. Others had been caught while trying to move drugs from the storage area to vehicles. By sunrise, Foster was back at the ranger station, looking exhausted but satisfied. "We've got 14 people in custody," she told Thomas and the assembled law enforcement officers. "And we've seized over 500 pounds of fentanyl and methamphetamine. Street value is in the millions." She pulled up photos on a laptop. "We also identified the operations leader. His name is Carl Hendricks, and he's actually a former park maintenance supervisor. He retired 8 years ago, but clearly kept using his knowledge of the park's layout to build this smuggling network." That explained a lot. Hendricks would have known about the sealed mining tunnels, the old service roads, and how to move around the park without being detected. He'd probably recruited Rick and maybe others to help him maintain access and information. "What about the drugs that were already distributed?" someone asked. "The shipments that already went out?" Agent Rodriguez from the DEA spoke up. "We've been coordinating with multiple agencies. Based on intelligence gathered during this operation, we've conducted raids at distribution points in 3 states. We're still processing those scenes, but initial reports suggest we've disrupted a major pipeline." Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. The threat that had been lurking in his park, the danger that had nearly killed Daniel, had been eliminated. The forest he'd sworn to protect was safe again. Foster approached him privately after the briefing ended. "You should know, Daniel wants to thank you personally. He's being released from the hospital tomorrow, and he asked if he could visit the park before he goes home to his family." Thomas smiled. "I'd like that, and I think I owe him a new camera." "Actually," Foster said with a slight grin, "his camera is evidence. We'll need to keep it for the trial, but I have a feeling there will be plenty of people wanting to hear his story. He might be able to afford a dozen new cameras." As the FBI began packing up their equipment and preparing to leave, Thomas walked outside and looked at the forest in the early morning light. It looked the same as it always had, peaceful and beautiful. But he knew it had been the site of something extraordinary. A story of survival, courage, and justice that had started with a simple discovery in a beaver dam and ended with one of the biggest drug busts in the state's history. The camera had told its story, and now the people responsible would face the consequences. The next morning came too quickly for Thomas. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what they might find in the forest. By the time the sun started creeping over the mountains, he was already at the ranger station with a fresh pot of coffee brewing. The building that had felt so familiar and quiet for years was now buzzing with activity. FBI agents moved purposefully through the space, checking equipment and coordinating plans over secure radio channels. Agent Foster gathered everyone for a briefing at 6. There were about 15 people crowded into the conference room now, a mix of FBI agents, search and rescue specialists, and a couple of experts from the Drug Enforcement Administration, who'd driven through the night to join them. Thomas recognized some of the search and rescue folks from previous operations. Good people who knew these mountains as well as he did. "Here's where we stand," Foster began, pointing to a large map that now covered most of one wall. "Our primary objective is twofold. First, locate Daniel Brennan. He's been missing for 4 weeks, and while the odds aren't in our favor, we proceed on the assumption that he's alive until we have evidence otherwise. Second, we need to gather intelligence on the operation running out of the old mining tunnel." She pointed to a spot on the map marked with red tape. "Last night, we deployed remote cameras and listening devices in the area around the mining tunnel. We're already picking up activity. At least 3 individuals entered the tunnel at approximately 2 this morning, and they haven't come out yet." Thomas felt a chill run through him. These people were operating with confidence, moving around in the middle of the night like they owned the place. It bothered him that something like this had been happening in his park, probably for months or even years, right under his nose. Agent Park took over, pulling up satellite images on a laptop connected to a projector. "We've been analyzing aerial footage from the past 6 months. Look at these thermal signatures." He clicked through several images showing heat patterns in the forest. "There's regular activity along this route here, connecting the old service road to the mining tunnel. Someone's been using ATVs or similar vehicles, probably at night when there's no chance of being spotted by hikers. One of the DEA agents, a stern-looking man named Rodriguez, spoke up. We've been tracking a distribution network operating in 3 states for the past year. Drugs moving through rural areas using unconventional routes. This could be one of their transit points. If we're right, we're looking at a significant operation. Foster nodded. Which is why we need to be extremely careful. These aren't amateurs. They've clearly done reconnaissance, they know the park layout, and they're armed. She looked directly at Thomas and the search and rescue team. When we go looking for Daniel, we're not just searching for a lost hiker. We're potentially moving through an active crime scene. Everyone needs to be alert. The search teams were divided into 3 groups. Thomas was assigned to lead one group through the area near where Daniel's camera had been found. The logic was simple. If Daniel had fallen into the creek and lost his camera, he might have stayed near water, especially if he was injured. The other 2 groups would work their way through the surrounding valleys and ridges. Before they headed out, Foster pulled Thomas aside one more time. I need you to understand something, she said quietly. If we encounter anyone out there who's connected to this operation, your job is to get your team to safety. Don't try to be a hero. We have armed agents positioned throughout the search area who can respond if needed. Thomas nodded, though the warning made him uneasy. He'd spent his entire career trying to make this park safe for visitors, and now he was being told there were dangerous criminals using it as a base for illegal operations. It felt wrong on every level. The search began at 7. Thomas's team consisted of himself, 2 search and rescue volunteers named Pete and Jennifer, and an FBI agent named Williams who didn't say much but carried enough equipment to stock a small army. They started at the point where Thomas had found the camera, then worked their way upstream, searching both sides of the creek carefully. The forest was beautiful in the early morning light, mist rising from the water and birds starting their daily songs, but Thomas couldn't enjoy it the way he normally would. Every shadow could be hiding something dangerous. Every sound made him pause and listen carefully. Pete and Jennifer seemed to sense it too, their usual casual chatter replaced by focused silence. They'd been searching for about 3 hours when Jennifer found something. Over here, she called softly, not wanting her voice to carry too far. She was kneeling near a fallen log, examining something on the ground. Thomas hurried over, followed by the others. Jennifer pointed to marks in the soil, partially hidden by fallen leaves. Boot prints, she said, and they're relatively fresh. See how the edges are still defined? I'd say within the last week or 2. Agent Williams took photos and measurements while Thomas examined the area more closely. The prints led away from the creek, heading deeper into the forest toward a rocky hillside. Someone was definitely here, Thomas said. And they were moving fast. Look at the spacing between the prints and how deep they pressed into the soil. They followed the trail carefully, Williams marking their position on a GPS device and radioing their coordinates back to the command center. The boot prints led them to a small cave opening, barely visible behind a tangle of bushes and rocks. It was the kind of place you could walk past 100 times and never notice unless you were specifically looking for it. Thomas felt his heart rate pick up. Daniel, he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the cave entrance. Daniel Brennan, if you're in there, we're here to help. FBI and park rangers. Silence. Thomas pulled out his flashlight and carefully approached the cave entrance, very aware that this could be dangerous for multiple reasons. The cave could be unstable, there could be wildlife inside, or worse, someone connected to the smuggling operation could be using it as a lookout point. The cave was shallow, maybe 15 feet deep, but it showed clear signs of recent habitation. There was a crude bed made from pine branches and leaves, a small collection of creek stones arranged in a circle, probably used to hold a tiny fire. And most tellingly, there were candy bar wrappers and an empty water bottle. Someone's been living here, Pete said, stating the obvious. Jennifer was examining the pine branch bed. And recently, these branches are still green in places. If they'd been here for weeks, they'd be completely brown and dried out. Agent Williams was on his radio immediately, reporting what they'd found. Thomas picked up the water bottle carefully, noting it was a brand sold at the park's visitor center. This could be Daniel's hideout, he said. Maybe he's been moving around, staying in different spots to avoid being found. But where is he now? Jennifer asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. They spent another hour searching the immediate area, finding more boot prints and evidence that someone had been foraging for food. Wild berries, edible plants, things that someone with basic survival knowledge would know to look for. Thomas felt a small spark of hope. If Daniel had the skills to survive this long in the wilderness, maybe he was still out there. Meanwhile, back at the command center, Agent Foster was dealing with a different set of developments. The surveillance equipment near the mining tunnel had recorded something interesting. A van had arrived just after dawn, and 4 people had unloaded what appeared to be supplies, food, water, and other provisions. They were resupplying, which meant they planned to continue operations. Even more concerning, the listening devices had picked up conversations that confirmed Rodriguez's suspicions. This was definitely a drug trafficking operation, and it was bigger than they'd initially thought. The tunnel system apparently connected to old mining routes that extended for miles underground, emerging at different points throughout the mountain range. It was a smuggler's dream, a hidden highway that law enforcement had no idea existed. Foster authorized additional surveillance teams and began coordinating with local police departments. They needed to identify all possible exit points from the tunnel system and have them monitored. But they also needed to be patient. Moving too soon could spook the operation and cause them to scatter, making it harder to catch everyone involved. By afternoon, Thomas's team had searched a 5-square-mile area, but found nothing more than the cave and some scattered evidence of Daniel's presence. They were taking a break near a scenic overlook, drinking water and eating sandwiches that someone had brought from town, when Williams's radio crackled to life. All teams, we have a development, Foster's voice came through. One of our wildlife cameras just captured footage of an individual matching Daniel Brennan's description. He's alive and mobile, but he appears injured. Thomas jumped to his feet. Where? He asked Williams urgently. Williams was already pulling up coordinates on his GPS. About 2 miles northwest of our current position, near the ranger's old supply cabin. Thomas knew exactly where that was. The cabin had been built decades ago as a shelter for rangers doing extended patrols in the backcountry. It wasn't used much anymore since they'd built better facilities closer to the main areas of the park. But it was still maintained and stocked with basic supplies. If Daniel found that cabin, he'd have food and shelter, Thomas said excitedly. He might have been moving between there and other hiding spots. Foster's voice came through the radio again. All search teams converge on the cabin location. But maintain caution. We don't know if he's alone or if he's being pursued. Medical team, be ready for emergency response. Thomas's team started moving immediately, with Williams leading the way using his GPS. They moved quickly but carefully, aware that they might not be the only ones looking for Daniel. If the smugglers had realized he was still alive and hiding in the area, they'd want to silence him before he could talk to authorities. The forest seemed to close in around them as they hiked, the afternoon sun creating long shadows through the trees. Thomas found himself constantly scanning the surroundings, looking for any sign of movement or danger. Pete and Jennifer were doing the same, their search and rescue training kicking in. They were about half a mile from the cabin when they heard it. A sound that made everyone freeze in their tracks. Someone was crashing through the underbrush ahead of them, moving fast and without any attempt at stealth. It could be wildlife, maybe a deer or elk spooked by their presence, but it could also be a person. Williams held up his hand, signaling everyone to stop. He spoke quietly into his radio, updating their position and the situation. From somewhere in the distance, Thomas could hear other teams moving through the forest, everyone converging on the same area. And then they saw him. A man stumbled into view about 50 yards ahead, limping badly and using a tree branch as a makeshift crutch. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face covered in scratches and what looked like several days' worth of beard growth. But there was no mistaking the features that matched the photos Thomas had seen. It was Daniel Brennan. Daniel, Thomas called out, stepping forward. We're here to help. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear. For a moment, Thomas thought he might run, might disappear back into the forest like a frightened animal. But then Daniel seemed to recognize the ranger uniform, the official presence of people who meant safety rather than danger. His legs buckled and he collapsed to his knees, the tree branch crutch falling beside him. Thomas and the others rushed forward. Jennifer, who had medical training, immediately began assessing Daniel's condition while Williams called for the medical team. Daniel was conscious but clearly exhausted, dehydrated, and suffering from multiple injuries. His left ankle was badly swollen, probably broken, and he had infected cuts on his arms and face. "Water," Daniel croaked, his voice barely audible. Thomas quickly handed over his water bottle, supporting Daniel's head while he drank. "Careful, not too fast," Jennifer cautioned. "You're safe now," Thomas said gently. "We've been looking for you. We found your camera." At the mention of the camera, Daniel's eyes focused more clearly. "The camera," he whispered. "Did you see? Did you see what they're doing?" "We saw," Thomas assured him. "The FBI is here. They know everything." Relief washed over Daniel's face, followed immediately by tears. "I thought I was going to die out here," he said. "I thought they'd find me or I'd starve. Or my ankle would get so infected that—" He trailed off, overcome with emotion. The medical team arrived within minutes, bringing a stretcher and proper supplies. As they worked on stabilizing Daniel for transport, Agent Foster appeared through the trees, slightly out of breath from hurrying through the rough terrain. "Daniel Brennan?" she asked, though she clearly knew the answer. Daniel nodded weakly. "Are my parents okay? Do they know I'm alive?" "They will very soon," Foster promised. "We need to get you to a hospital first, but then you'll be able to talk to them." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We also need to hear everything you can tell us about what you saw out there." As they loaded Daniel onto the stretcher and began the careful journey back to where a helicopter could land and evacuate him, Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. They'd found him. Against all odds, after 4 weeks in the wilderness, injured and hunted, Daniel had survived. The camera had done its job, preserving the evidence and leading them to this moment. But the investigation was far from over. In fact, Thomas realized as he watched the FBI agents talking quietly among themselves, it was just beginning. The woman who answered Thomas's call identified herself as Agent Linda Foster. Her voice was professional, calm, the kind of voice that had probably talked people through all sorts of emergencies. Thomas tried to keep his own voice steady as he explained what he'd found. A camera in a beaver dam. Videos that showed something suspicious in the park. A hiker who might be in serious trouble. He knew it sounded strange, maybe even paranoid, but Agent Foster didn't laugh or brush him off. Instead, she asked him to stay exactly where he was and not to touch anything else on the camera. She'd be there in a few hours. Those few hours felt like days. Thomas sat at his desk, staring at the camera, occasionally glancing at his computer screen where that disturbing video was still paused. He'd only watched it once, but the images were burned into his mind. He tried to do some paperwork, tried to focus on his usual duties, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the hiker in those videos. Where was he now? Was he okay? Or had something terrible happened out there in the woods? Agent Foster arrived at exactly 2 in the afternoon, along with her partner, Agent Kevin Park. They weren't what Thomas had expected FBI agents to look like. Not that he'd had much experience with federal investigators. Foster was maybe in her early 40s, wearing hiking boots and a practical jacket over her business clothes. Park was younger, probably mid-30s, and he carried a large metal case that Thomas assumed held some kind of technical equipment. Thomas showed them to the conference room, the only space in the small ranger station with enough room for all of them to sit comfortably. He'd closed the blinds and made sure they wouldn't be interrupted. Foster set up her laptop while Park examined the camera, taking photos of it from every angle and making notes on a tablet. When everything was ready, Thomas played the footage from the beginning. He wanted the agents to see the full progression, to understand how the tone of the videos changed. The first clips were innocent enough, and he could see both agents relaxing slightly, probably thinking this was going to be a waste of time. A lost camera, an overreacting park ranger, nothing worth the 2-hour drive. But then came the 3rd day of footage. The hiker, who'd introduced himself as Daniel in the earlier videos, was moving through a part of the forest that Thomas recognized immediately. It was near the old mining area, a section of the park that had been closed to the public for decades. The mines had shut down back in the 70s, and the entrances had supposedly been sealed for safety reasons. Nobody went out there anymore. It was too remote, too dangerous, and the trails didn't lead that direction. In the video, Daniel was clearly lost. He was checking his GPS device and looking frustrated. He mentioned something about his compass giving him weird readings and deciding to backtrack. But before he could turn around, he heard voices. The camera went shaky as Daniel apparently ducked behind some rocks and his breathing got louder, faster. He was scared. Thomas watched the agents' faces as the video continued. Daniel had zoomed in with his camera, trying to capture what he was seeing. There were 4 men, maybe 5, it was hard to tell exactly. They were unloading wooden crates from 2 all-terrain vehicles, carrying them toward what looked like an old mining entrance. The tunnel opening was partially hidden by overgrown bushes, but it was definitely there. These men weren't casual hikers. They moved with purpose, and even through the camera's small microphone, you could hear fragments of their conversation. One voice, rough and commanding, said something about keeping the shipment on schedule. Another mentioned distribution points and covering the routes. But what made Thomas's hands go cold when he first heard it, and what made Agent Foster lean forward in her chair now, was when one of the men said, "We can't have anyone stumbling on this operation. This park stays clean, understand?" The video showed the men were armed, not hunting rifles or the kind of guns you might carry for protection against bears. These were serious weapons, the kind that suggested these people were involved in something illegal and were willing to protect it. Daniel must have realized the danger he was in, because the video quality suddenly got worse as he started backing away, trying to move quietly through the underbrush. For a few minutes, the footage was just shaky images of trees and sky as Daniel apparently ran. His breathing was ragged, panicked. Then there was a sound, a shout from somewhere behind him. Someone had spotted him. The camera swung wildly as Daniel picked up speed, branches whipping past, his feet pounding on the forest floor. And then suddenly a splash. The image went dark for a second before coming back, now showing an underwater view. Daniel had fallen into the creek, or maybe jumped in trying to lose whoever was chasing him. The camera must have come loose from wherever Daniel had it attached. The final seconds of footage showed bubbles and murky water, then a brief glimpse of the rocky creek bed, and finally, just as the video ended, a pair of boots stepping into frame at the water's edge. Someone had been right behind him. After that, there was nothing. No more videos, no more photos. Just the camera, presumably swept downstream by the current until it got stuck in the Beaver Dam where Thomas had found it. The conference room was silent for a long moment after the video ended. Agent Foster was the first to speak. "How long ago did you say you found this?" she asked, her voice tight with focus. Thomas checked his notes. "This morning around 8:30. The timestamp on the last video shows it was recorded 22 days ago. 22 days. Thomas watched as Foster and Park exchanged a look. They were both thinking the same thing he'd been thinking since he first saw this footage. What had happened to Daniel in those 22 days? Had he escaped? Was he hiding somewhere in the park, injured and scared, or had those men caught him? Park pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway to make a call. Thomas could hear him talking in a low voice, requesting backup and technical support. Foster turned her attention back to Thomas. "I need you to show me exactly where you found this camera," she said. "And I need to know everything you can tell me about that mining area." Thomas pulled out a topographical map of the park and spread it across the conference table. He pointed to Willow Creek, tracing the path of the water with his finger. "The Beaver Dam is here about 2 miles downstream from the old Copper Valley mine entrance. If the camera fell into the water where it looks like it did in that video, the current would have carried it downstream until it hit the dam." Foster studied the map carefully. "This mining area, you said it's closed to the public?" "Has been for years," Thomas confirmed. "The company that owned it went bankrupt in the 70s, and the government sealed the tunnels. At least they were supposed to seal them. We don't patrol out there regularly because there are no official trails leading that way. And we post signs warning people to stay out. But someone could access it if they knew where to look," Park said, returning from his phone call. Thomas nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, if you had the right equipment and knew the area well enough. There are some old service roads from the mining days, mostly overgrown now. But you could probably get an ATV through if you were determined." Foster made some notes on her tablet. "We need to run a search on anyone reported missing in this area recently. The man in the video, Daniel, he's our priority right now." She looked at Thomas. "Have there been any missing person reports filed with the Park Service in the last month?" Thomas thought back through the logs. "Nothing that matches. We had a family report their teenage son missing about 6 weeks ago. But he turned up the same day, just wandered off the trail and got turned around. And there was an elderly couple who were late checking out from their campsite, but they just lost track of time." He paused. But people don't always report directly to us. Sometimes they go straight to local police or sheriff's department. Park was already typing on his laptop, accessing databases that Thomas didn't have clearance for. Got something, he said after a few minutes. Daniel Brennan, 34 years old, reported missing by his family 4 weeks ago. Last known location was this park. His car was found in the parking lot at the northern trailhead. 4 weeks. That meant Daniel had been missing for about a week, before he even recorded that final video. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. I remember that car, he said slowly. Blue sedan, been sitting in that lot for a while. We thought maybe someone had car trouble and caught a ride into town. It happens sometimes. Do we have any indication that Mr. Brennan survived whatever happened after this video? Foster asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer was probably no. Nothing definite, Park said, still scrolling through information on his screen. But no body has been found either. Search and rescue did a basic sweep of the main trail areas when he was reported missing, but they didn't find anything. They assumed he'd left the park somehow. Foster stood up and walked to the window looking out at the forest. He could still be out there, she said quietly. If he managed to evade whoever was chasing him, if he's injured or hiding, he could still be alive. She turned back to Thomas and Park. We need to move fast on this. 2 operations running simultaneously. 1, we need a thorough search for Daniel Brennan. And 2, we need surveillance on that mining tunnel. Thomas felt himself being pulled deeper into something much bigger than he'd anticipated when he pulled that camera from the Beaver Dam this morning. What do you think they're moving through there? He asked, though he had a pretty good idea. Based on the conversation fragments and the level of security they seem to have, I'd say drugs. Foster replied bluntly. The park is the perfect cover. Remote. Not heavily patrolled in certain areas and with old infrastructure like those mining tunnels that can be repurposed. They bring the drugs in through one side of the mountain and move them out through the other, completely off the radar. Park closed his laptop. We've got resources mobilizing now. Should have a team here by tonight to set up surveillance equipment. But we need to be smart about this. If these people are as organized as they seem, they'll have lookouts, maybe even people planted in town or among the park staff. That last comment made Thomas uncomfortable. He knew all the other rangers personally, had worked with most of them for years. But Park was right to be cautious. If there was this much money involved, people could be bought.